Hi, Giles.
Hey, Misha, how are you?
Um,
It's been a
I'm
while.
I'm okay. How are you?
I'm good. I'm tired. Actually, you have to excuse me. This is the first time I've sat down all day, so I'm having my first coffee of the day, which has to be a huge bowl.
And for those who don't know, it is 4 p.m. for you right now. Is that right? 3 p.m.,
Yeah,
4
it's
p.m.
about 4 p.m. Been going since 6 this morning. Just been nonstop speaking to friends and colleagues in Ukraine, trying to think of things we can do to help people in loads of different scenarios. From my colleagues, I have a lot of photographer friends, filmmaker friends, Ukrainian photographers, local NGOs, people with disability. I mean, the need is just obviously, as anyone can imagine, is so widespread and desperate.
I can't imagine how difficult it must be for it. There's to organize this on a personal and nonprofit level as opposed to having like this should be the purview of governments, right? And yet everyone is rallying. I was speaking to someone from Poland yesterday who has just been working around the clock taking stuff across the border because it's a porous border right there, and anything and everything is useful right now, ranging from food to spare car tires and everything in between. um, I wanted to, we scheduled this call a little while ago before the shit hit the fan in Ukraine, and we wanted to give everyone an update on the projects that we have worked on together with Gish and Random Acts and Legacy of War and yourself and the partnership that has evolved over the years. Um, so I think maybe if this is okay with you, I would love maybe for you to give us a little bit of an update on where we are with some of those projects, and then we can pivot and talk about what we collectively can do and how we can best support you and the work, frankly, on the ground that you have been organizing so far in Ukraine. Does that sound okay to you?
I'm going to take a massive sip of coffee first, then.
Okay. This, by the way, this just a counterbalance. This is my coffee, so I'm not compensating for anything here, Giles.
um, I think it'd be nice maybe actually to go back a little bit and tell a little bit of my own story just to give context. Really, it was kind of my own experience of getting injured in Afghanistan in 2011 that indirectly led to us meeting and to the partnership and how it evolved. And so, I'm going to tell a little bit about that story, but I don't want to dwell on actually what happened in terms of my accident. I mean, it's well documented. I was working in Afghanistan as a photographer, covering the humanitarian crisis of the war there when I stepped on a landmine. I lost both my legs, my left arm, and was to spend nearly a year in hospital recovering from those injuries. The bit I want to talk about actually is that word that's getting used a lot at the moment, resilience. I think resilience is a very overused word, but also an incredibly powerful word. And it's something that maybe we've all experienced due to lockdown, to our own traumas, our own experiences. It's something that's getting referred to a lot at the moment about the Ukrainian people. And I just wanted to give my insight into the incredible power that resilience gives us and how I believe resilience is actually life's gift for the difficult times that we go through. So I'm going to take you not to when I got injured, but I'm going to take you to the moment when I regained my consciousness 3 days after the accident. I'd been flown back to the UK. I was lying in a hospital bed in Birmingham, and I regained my consciousness and found myself in what I call the ultimate lockdown. I want everybody listening just to imagine for a moment. My hand, my one remaining hand, was in a cast, so I couldn't move my fingers. It was strapped to the bed. I found my whole body actually was strapped to the bed, including my head, which had straps here, so I couldn't move in the slightest. I tried to scream as soon as I regained my consciousness, but I had tubes actually here into my throat, in my nose, down my mouth, so I couldn't speak or make any kind of noise. I was in a white room, the lights were on, people were rushing around, there was a lot of noise. I was very disorientated. And I realized at that moment the only way I could communicate with the world was by blinking. There was nothing else I had control over. I couldn't even control when I went to the toilet. That was all done by tubes. I mean, every single part of my body had been taken over apart from the ability to blink. For about the first 24 hours, nobody even realized that I'd regained my consciousness. I was blinking crazily, but everyone was just rushing around busy. It was the most frightening moment of my life, more frightening actually than when I got injured. It was terrifying to be locked in my own mind, desperately screaming, thinking you're dying, thinking these are your last moments, and not able to communicate with a single person. I would describe it like being thrown in the freezing cold water. You know, your breath's taken away, you can't breathe, you're panicking. That's how I felt. But as I say, not being able to vocalize that, not being able to scream. So I quickly realized I was going to have to find a way to regain some kind of control, I guess, in my own world, in this locked down world of my own imagination. So I started creating projects. I started creating a little universe where I would live and trying to ignore all the crazy things that were going on around me. I mean, the nurses and doctors were amazing. They tried to help me communicate with this sheet with the alphabet written on it. But, you know, this is like the National Health Service in the UK. They're crazy busy, and we can only do it by they point at all the letters and I blink. And then we go to the next letter and I blink again. And then suddenly, you know, one of the nurses, somebody would shout something at them. They would turn around and they go back and they go, oh, where were we? And we had to start again. I mean, it was impossible. So I realized, yeah.
that sounds like the truest test of patience right there. Wow.
Yeah, there was actually one time when a nurse, it's amazing, we were having a bad day, even though I couldn't communicate, just blinking. And this nurse had lost his temper a little bit, came back at the end of his shift to say, look, I'm really sorry. It was a really bad day for both of us. And I was blinking like this, crazy at him. And he was a bit like, look, we haven't got time for this now. And I was trying to blink to him, I'm about to be sick. And then was sick all over him. Poor guy.
No.
So anyway, it was like this locked down, extreme version. And I started creating things in my mind. And one of the projects I created was called 100 Portraits Before I Die. And I imagined 100 people I wished I'd done portraits of during my photographic career. And I would visualize those photo shoots. As I say, it was like an exercise in my mind where I would imagine meeting the person, whether we'd have a cup of tea or a coffee, glass of wine, the conversation, whether I photograph in the studio or on location, the lighting, the cameras, everything about that shoot. And at the end, I would see the result of that photograph and I would critique it and say, you know what, maybe you try this differently next time and do something in a different way. And I worked my way through these portraits. I had no idea of time. In intensive care, the lights never go off. There's no clocks, there's no windows. You know, you really are disorientated. And bearing in mind, I was there for 46 days like this, only able to blink. And so the only thing I knew was the nurses came every so often to take my vital signs. And that was kind of my unit of time. So I'd do one of these portraits in each one of these units. And this, to me, shows how incredible the human mind is. Because if I look at what I was doing before my accident and the way I work as a photographer now, my technique has completely changed. The cameras I use, the lighting, the way I approach the subject, everything has changed. And all of that happened during those 46 days in lockdown where I could only take photographs in my imagination. And that for me is what resilience is. That's what the human mind is capable of. Even when you are literally locked down, you cannot move anything. You can only blink to communicate with the world. Even then, we can learn, we can create our imagination, can create a universe, and we can improve ourselves as people. So I came out of that 46 days. I then had about 30 operations. I spent a year in hospital. And I left and I wanted to carry on my photographic work and try and use this experience that I'd had in lockdown to, I guess, build relationships with the kind of people that I've always documented, those affected by conflict around the world. And I say, this is where the word resilience is important. People often say to me, you must connect with the people you photograph because of your injuries. They must see your missing limbs and see a bond. And actually, that's not the case. Many of the people I photograph have suffered psychological violence, other forms of violence. They've been displaced. They're not necessarily physically injured. But we relate because of the shared quality, I suppose you could call it, of resilience. And I think when we go through really difficult times, like I did during those 46 days or the year in hospital, life gives us a gift, and that gift is resilience. And for me, resilience means we can celebrate life in ways maybe you can't before. I get more pleasure now from life than I ever did. Even the smallest things, even the things that can annoy another person, like being stuck in a traffic jam, I can find pleasure and joy in that because I'm alive and able to share that moment. And I think that's what I'm able to share with the people I photograph and the people that we've gone on to help with at Gish. So I'm going to actually show some slides now. You'll have to excuse my technical mishaps, but hopefully we can share a screen. And I just wanted to share a few stories and a few photographs, but I'm going to start actually with a photograph that I took of myself. Resilience. As I say, it's a word that gets often used. This photograph I'm going to show you is my illustration, my self-portrait of resilience. It was actually taken when I was still in hospital. One of my friends came, he broke me out of hospital. We went to his photographic studio and I did this self-portrait. Now, up to this point, this was about 3 months after I was injured, I was still very embarrassed about the way I looked. I didn't want people to see my injuries. When they came to visit me in hospital, I would cover up my missing arm. I never let anybody see the stumps of my legs. I was ashamed. In fact, I remember just before taking this photograph, it was the first time I'd seen myself in a mirror. I'd sort of put on a wheelchair and taken to have a shower. And I remember crying myself to sleep thinking, I don't want to be this person. I'm not strong enough to deal with this new reality of having no legs, of an arm missing, of life potentially in a wheelchair. The way I felt, I looked so disfigured. I was kind of horrified by seeing myself. So I decided what I had to do was go and do a self-portrait. And so I did this self-portrait. And this was the moment I took control of my own life again. This was the moment I said, I don't care what people think of when they look at me, because what's important is how I see myself. And I knew in this photograph, having gone through those 46 days of an intensive care unit, of only being able to blink, of being stuck in my own imagination, I knew that I was actually the strongest I'd ever been. I was more focused than I'd ever been. And in fact, I was a better man than I'd ever been. And that's what this self-portrait was. This was a portrait of resilience. Now, at the end of this year, I returned to work. I went to rehab. They taught me how to walk again. They taught me how to make these strange grimacing faces as well. I learned how to hold a camera. And the first thing I did was go back to Lebanon, a place I'd worked for many years in the past. And I wanted to document some of Syria's most vulnerable refugees, people like Khulud. Khulud had been at home in Syria. We've talked about her story in the past, but I'm sure many people don't know the full story. And basically, she was at home in Syria when a sniper shot her in the neck. She was left paralyzed from the neck down. She actually fell on top of one of her children. Her family managed to get her into Lebanon. They got emergency medical treatment. But when I met her, she was living in this unfinished homemade tent made of bits of cardboard, plastic, billboards ripped down from posters. And it was just a horrible, horrible situation for anybody to live in, especially a woman who was tetraplegic, paralyzed from the neck down. Her husband, Jamal, was her full-time carer. The children, the 3 children, would sleep on the floor by her bed. It was really a desperate situation. I remember asking Khulud, what's your one hope for the future? She said, Giles, I just want to be a mother again. On this trip, I met Reem. Again, Reem's story was very similar. She'd been injured in Syria by a rocket that hit her house. She was sleeping in bed. Her husband was killed in the bed next to her. She lost one of her legs. She was living on the top floor of this unfinished building, unable to get up and down the stairs because of her missing limb. The only person that lived with her was her father, Ahmed. Now, if you go online and you look at some of my photographs, you'll see I love to travel with this kind of white sheet. I think it's a way to sort of give people their dignity, to take them away from the difficult environment that they're living in. And I always photograph these people looking directly at the camera. But with Ahmed on this rooftop, every time I was about to take his photograph, he would look away from me. And I was getting increasingly frustrated. I kept saying, no, look at me, look at me. And as I took the photograph, he would look away. Eventually, I had to say, well, why do you look away when you take this photograph? And he said, Giles, look at the distance. You see the mountains? And I said, yes. He said, well, those mountains are Syria. I'm in Lebanon. I'm an old man. I will probably never return home. So that's why I live on this rooftop. So the first thing I see in the morning and the last thing I see at night is my homeland. And that's why I photographed Ahmed not looking at me, but instead looking to his home. On this trip as well, I met a young girl called Aya. Now, I don't like to show people as victims of circumstance, but not victims in their own right. But with this young girl, Aya, I was really struggling. I met her, she was in a tent. She was 4 years old. It was muddy, wet. She has spina bifida, meaning she's paralyzed from the waist down. She was struggling to even sit up. And I thought, if I photograph her, it would just be this kind of dramatic picture making her look like a victim. So I said, you know what? I'm going to leave it. I'm not going to take a photograph. I'll just spend the day with the family. Now, as you know, Misha, not for the first time in my life, I was completely and utterly wrong about something. And actually with Aya, it turned out that she was, in fact, the feistiest 4-year-old in my life I've ever met. She was not a victim. She, in fact, ran not just her family, she ran the whole refugee camp. I first realized when her sister Iman walked in and Aya looked up at her and she said, "Hey, donkey, pick me up." And her sister picked her up. We walked around the refugee camp. She would see somebody selling bread and she'd be like, "Hey, donkey, give me some bread." Somebody selling water. "Hey, donkey, give me the water." And everybody would do whatever Aya basically was told them to do. And so in the end, I was able to make this photograph of Aya, which really summed up her spirit. Like I say, I don't want to show people as victims. Instead, I want to show the energy, the love, the sort of humanity of people. And this is her playing hopscotch with her sister. Now, I came back from this trip. It was an important moment in my own recovery because after this, I was kind of going back to work full time. And 2 years later, I was asked to go back and to document the refugee crisis across the Middle East and Europe. Sadly, scenes that we're too familiar with of boats crossing oceans. But I also wanted to go back and meet some of those families that I'd met 2 years before. I went back and I found people like my friend Ahmed. Now, I think it's great to take photographs back with you. It's a kind of nice gesture to give somebody the image you've created of them. But for a guy with no legs and one arm, taking a photographic print halfway around the world is a pain in the ass. And I get there and I give Ahmed his picture and I'm really pleased with it. And obviously it was this beautiful story. I was just telling you about why I photographed in that way. But he just looked at it and then he looked up at me and he just said, "Giles, you made me look really old in this." And I was like, well, there's gratitude.
Vanity.
Yeah, exactly. Reem was still on the rooftop, but life had returned to some kind of normalcy. She had more family members with her now. They cooked on the table, her brother, her sister-in-law, some other kids were living there. But of course, for all these families in Lebanon, living as refugees means their life is stuck in limbo. This is Reem with her daughter, Sarah. I asked Sarah, as you would with any kid of that age, what's your favorite subject at school? Tell me about your friends. And she said, well, I have no school and I have no friends because I live on this rooftop. And that is the reality for these families. I, of course, tracked down Aya and her family. They'd moved to these unfinished buildings up in the north of Lebanon. Aya was as feisty as ever. This was her being pushed by her brother. And she was just screaming, "Faster, donkey, faster." But again, like Reem's family, they're stuck in limbo. The parents aren't legally allowed to work. They can't take Aya to hospital when she's sick. The children weren't able to go to school. Now, the real reason I wanted to sort of share this story with you was because of the phone call that I got on the last day I was there on this trip. It was a phone call that really changed everything. It was from Jamal, the husband of Khulud, the woman who'd been paralyzed by a sniper. He rang me and he said, "Giles, we hear you're back in Lebanon. We'd love to see you." Now, obviously, I'd managed to track down a lot of the families that I'd met 2 years before, but a lot had moved, a lot had changed phone numbers. Some I was just not able to find. Khulud, I'd not even bothered to go and look for her in the same place because I thought of all the people I'd met 2 years before, nobody had been in more need. Those photographs had been published around the world. Charities, NGOs had used those pictures. I thought something would have changed. So when Jamal rang me, I said, "Of course, I'd love to see you. Where are you now?" And he said, "Giles, we're in the same place." And I repeated my question. I said, no, where are you living now? And he said, we are in that same tent. And honestly, I felt physically sick when I heard him. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. You know, I thought, who could have been in more need than Khulud was? You know, this paralyzed woman living in a tent that they'd made themselves. How could she be there 2 years later? I went to see them the next morning. I walked into the tent and I burst into tears when I saw Khulud. She was lying on the same bed. She had not moved for 2 years. She had not been out, no daylight, nothing. And
I remember you. I remember you talking about this moment before, and mentioning that you felt like, what the hell is the point of the work that I'm doing if I'm documenting a story that's so compelling and so tragic as this for the world to see? And the world did see. The world saw that story of that family, and yet nothing changed over the course of 2 years. And
exactly.
yeah, and that was that, hearing your helplessness and heartbrokenness about that. I remember being very compelling. Like, right, how is that possible?
Well, no, exactly. And, you know, as a photographer and a filmmaker, you go out there because you want to create change. You want to make a difference. We risk our lives. We go to these places like many of my colleagues are in Ukraine right now because you want people to respond to it. And so when you photograph somebody who's in such desperate need and then you find nothing's happened, you know, as I say, I walked in there and I burst into tears and looked at Khulud and I said, you know, I failed you. Now she's like an angel. She just smiled and she's like, it's okay. We knew you'd come back. And I realized all I could do was just to photograph her, you know, her story in a better way, which is what I did over the next kind of week. I would go there every day and photograph daily life. Now, if you imagine, this is Jamal in the little room that's kind of their kitchen on the side. This man has lost everything. You know, his many of his family members have been killed in Syria, his home, his work. He lives in this tent. And you know what his greatest fear is? I remember he would whisper to me in the kitchen, his greatest fear was that Khulud did not love him as much as he loved her. You know, their story is the most romantic of stories. He is her full-time carer. The children do homework on the bed. There's laughter. You know, the food's incredible. It's a really the warmest, most lovely place you could imagine being, despite all these incredible hardships. But on the last day, I had this problem because I had the photograph in my bag that I'd taken 2 years before. And as I say, I like to share those photographs. And I was like, well, do I show them this photograph? Do I show them the photograph I did 2 years before? Won't it remind them that nothing has changed? But I thought, no, I have to. So I reached into my bag and I took out the photograph that I'd done 2 years before. And as you see, it's almost identical to what I was seeing now. And this was the photograph from 2 years before. But before I gave it to Khulud, I looked at her and I said, when I took this photograph, I did not take a photograph of a refugee. I did not take a photograph of a woman living with a disability. But when I took this photograph, I was taking a photograph of a couple who were so in love with each other. And this was a photograph of love. And that's the moment I realized I'm not a war photographer. I go to some of the worst places you could imagine, but what I do there, I document a grandmother brushing her granddaughter's hair, a mother feeding her baby, a father on the floor doing lessons with his children, a couple like Khulud and Jamal holding hands, looking into each other's eyes and dreaming of a better future. And that is what I photograph. And that, I think, is really what brought our lives together, Misha, was coming back with this message, that this was a message of love. And I think that's something that you related to with the work that you were doing and with the amazing Gish community, was sending this message that even in the hardest times, even in the moments we look at and we see things like Ukraine, where it just seems like hatred and violence is ruling the world, at the heart of it are people, are families, couples, children, their parents, and their love. And that is what we support. That is what we do everything we can to protect, to nourish, to give an opportunity. And that, I think, is the message that we have connected on. And that's really that moment of Khulud, going back to seeing her, realizing for myself that I would have to do things more directly to help people, and also realizing that what I wanted to focus on was these stories of love. That was the moment really that we connected, that we were able to start this work. And of course, we shared Khulud's story and the story of Aya and many of the other refugees. And we were able to have that initial crowdfunding campaign, had this huge impact. And I remember, one of the happiest moments in my life was a few months after, the first Gish campaign that we did, going back and hearing that Khulud had been relocated. I wasn't actually able to be there, but my friend was there, helped them relocate. And I got this Skype phone call from the first day that they were there in their new home. And I remember Khulud saying to me, thank you, because for the first time, she felt truly like she could be a mother again. We had her wheelchair, she could go out in the garden, watch the children. And it was just the most amazing moment. I should actually just explain this screenshot from this Skype chat that I had with Khulud and Jamal and the family. He's looking at me in this certain way because actually she just said to me that maybe she was more in love with me than him. And this was him. I don't think so.
I can't believe that you're such a homewrecker. I remember so this, just for anyone who doesn't know, we folded your story of Khulud and her family into the Gish hunt, and we asked people to ask other people. We weren't asking participants for money, but we were asking them to ask other people to donate, and we had it as an item in our hunt, and then we told their story and said we need to help. We need to provide them with access to medical care, get a wheelchair for Khulud, and get them into permanent shelter, and hopefully get them into school, the kids into like regular schooling. And then we went to bed and woke up the next morning, and we had met our goal. We had enough money to pay for them to have all of those things for the next 5 years. And so then we said, okay, great, we helped this family. Now we're going to help Aya's family. Mm-hmm. And it cascaded. And I think ultimately we were able in the course of that one Gish hunt and that one fundraiser to help several families. I think we ended up at 4 or 5 families.
Yeah, it became 5 families. And, in fact, one of them stories was a young girl called Huala. And, Huala was 12, 13 years old at the time. She's now 17, close to graduating. And we're still able to support her. And so that is the incredible thing as well, is that, all these projects that we get involved with, it's not about just this kind of immediate, trying to help somebody out that moment. It's actually looking at this long term. How do we get people to get education, to get rehoused, whatever it is that's going to give them that stability to be able to really move forward with their lives and give them a long term impact and change. And that's what we're able to do with all those families. Khulud's living in Holland now, Aya's family's in France, and the families that are still in Lebanon, we are still supporting them as the children grow up and hopefully go on to maybe even go to university. In fact, I should give just a little kind of heads up. As you know, I've been doing this TV series, The One-Armed Chef, about food and travel and stories. And the second episode, which will come out on the 6th of April on Vice, is about Huala and the families that we've been supporting in Lebanon. So it will be a great opportunity for people. There's some beautiful scenes of cooking, where I see Huala and her family, and I take them to the beach and try and cook for them, and they just make fun of me, kind of going, what is this stupid guy trying to do? I'm trying to cook a fish on the beach. It seemed like a good idea, but it absolutely goes completely wrong, and everyone's just making fun of me. But it's a beautiful moment where you see this amazing young woman who, when we met her at 12 or 13, was destitute, was living in a tent with nothing, now flourishing, full of energy, full of life. And that is all thanks to Gish.
Well, and no, it's thanks to you and your work and our collaboration. And also we should thank Random Acts too, because Random Acts was a part of that. So it's a Gish, Giles, Random Acts tripod there, triangle. Love triangle. That's what it was.
Triangle of good.
Yeah. Do you want to maybe briefly talk about the farming project as well?
Yeah, the farming project is another great one. We've obviously done the dance school in South Africa. We've done the demining in Laos. And we could talk about all these different projects, but I think the Land for Women in Rwanda is particularly close to my heart. because it's grown from what we started. Quite literally, we planted a seed that has grown and grown and grown. And, you know, the women in Rwanda, when I met them, it was a woman called Olive who had survived the genocide, gone through a terrible experience, and a story we can share maybe another time, because it's quite a long story. But she had gone through some of the worst hardships you could imagine. She'd lost her whole family to the genocide. She was eking out a living, really at the bottom of rung of society. You know, she was really treated badly by the people around her. She grew potatoes in a field with a few other women, and they received virtually no money for it. And so when I asked her, you know, how can we help you? Her answer was simple. She goes, give us the land. If we have the land, we can grow and we can really achieve amazing things. And so that's what we were able to do, again, with Gish and Random Acts. We were able to buy the first cooperative farm, set it up, and that project has grown and grown and grown. And I was there in October, end of last year, to see how it's all coming along. And I can't really express what has happened to those women, to see the confidence that they have, to see how their lives have changed. You know, as Olive said, she goes, I walk with my head held high now, because people now see me as a landowner. I get respect. And, you know, the children are going back to school. One of the great things is I visited 3 of the farms that we have. There's no children working there, because now the women are earning more money. They can focus on making sure the kids are at school. They see futures. They can plan. They have choice. You know, it's amazing to see how it's changed. And it's grown. As I say, we have more farms that will be coming in the next couple of years. And I think if there's anything in my life that I'll look back on with real pride, it will be that Land for Women project, because what we have collectively done is change the lives of whole communities, of whole families, permanently. You know, it's once they're set up as landowners, once they are able to now have bank accounts to borrow, to set up funding for universities for their children, all these different things, it's enabling them to invest in their own futures, which they were never able to do before.
And just to explain a little bit more, the women that there were about 500 women, right, in these 2 farming communities.
Yeah, so over the various cooperatives now, yeah.
Yeah, and you had asked them, like, how can we help you? They're all Rwandan genocide survivors. They've all gone through the most horrific traumas you can imagine, and we're lucky to be alive, and we're lucky to still, you know, many of them still have children who were alive, but they're leasing their land, and they're subsistence farming on leased land, which basically made them serfs. They were basically unable to get ahead. They were barely able to get enough food for themselves and their family to eat, because the lease on the land took every last penny. So what we were able to do through Gish and Random Acts was help you identify plots of land that we could actually purchase in perpetuity and give to these female farmers, so that they could then have their own stakes and actually build wealth slowly over time as they continued to farm.
And we've developed an amazing, thanks to a Uganda woman called Prize, we have a local team, and they've developed this amazing program. There's over 5 years that teaches the women everything from organic, sustainable farming. They're environmentally friendly. It teaches them about banking, all these different things that mean their whole lives now are changed. It's just the most incredible thing to go there and see the work that they're doing on the land, and the pride that they have, and the opportunity that they have now for a completely different life.
Okay, so Giles, we're about to launch another Gish mini hunt that's coming up this weekend, and registration is closing on Wednesday. And we have been thinking about, you know, how we can best be of service to the people in Ukraine right now. Everyone who registers, a portion of that registration is going to go to fund World Central Kitchen, which is providing food to refugees. Right now, there are about 10 million people who are displaced in Ukraine already, and that number is growing, and they all are in need of support. And I know that you did an episode of your show, One Armed Chef, in Ukraine. When does that air?
Yeah, I've been going to Ukraine for many years. In fact, first place I ever did a photographic project was there in Odessa nearly 20 years ago. So Ukraine has a place really close to my heart. And for the last few years, since 2015, with the recent violence, I've been documenting things in the Donbass region. The situation there has been bad for a long time. I mean, a lot of people don't realize that between 10 and 15,000 people died in the conflict up to that stage. It's been simmering away there for a long time. I don't think anyone expected, though, for it to explode into the violence that we're seeing, and Putin just losing his mind. Sadly, I've been documenting his tactics in places like Syria. We've seen the violence that he exhibits to individuals. He purposely targets hospitals. He purposely targets schools. This is his operating manner. I mean, this is
right. You've been you've been documenting the devastation in Putin's wake for a long time. I think a lot of people don't quite realize that Putin's support of Assad in Syria was very much responsible for the horrific humanitarian crisis there, and that and frankly, for Khaloud's being shot in the spine, like that actually can be traced back to Putin, and those tactics were brutal, and it was all about civilian, casual collateral damage being a part of the strategy.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. They know for a fact that they targeted hospitals. They would find the hospitals and target them. They would target schools. They purposely want to create fear. They want to force people away from areas. It's ethnic cleansing. When they open humanitarian corridors that are mined, this is stuff he's been doing for years, for over a decade in Syria, in Grozny. It's hard to witness what he is doing because it is designed to kill civilians. I'll show you a few slides of images that I've done in the last couple of years in Ukraine, which will give you just a slight sense of place. These were done, as say, in Donbass, which has been the front line for many years. The whole area is devastated, but this was one small region. Unfortunately, this is what we're seeing now across the whole of Ukraine is buildings, residential places being shelled, being attacked by rockets, by planes. This was a school in Donbass. Again, you could tell the schools and hospitals had been specifically targeted. I spent some time there on the front lines. Every day at the moment, I'm thinking about these people that I've met over the years. Many of the soldiers there are such young guys, 17, 18, who are the proudest people you could imagine. Ukrainians are an incredible people, incredibly proud of their country. And I know that they will not give an inch against Putin. But it's the families caught up in the middle of it. When I was there already in the area of Donbass, there are so many traumatized children who have been living with this conflict for many, many years. It's hard to imagine, again, how this will affect the whole of the country. As you said, 10 million people already displaced, but I think of people like this woman who made me the most amazing borscht. I heard just yesterday that her house has been destroyed. She is missing. Most of the people in these photographs are no longer with us because they were in the area of Advika, which is seeing some of the heaviest fighting. I was there last year to make a show, as I'm doing this series, The One-Armed Chef, which is using food to try and bring humanity to some of these stories. I know that seems hard to imagine when we're talking about such brutality, but it's important. And I have a couple of really good friends who are Ukrainian chefs, and they said to me, people also have to remember about our culture, about what we were before the war. Don't just see us as this country, embedded with war. What Putin also wants to do, and what he keeps talking about, is saying that Ukraine does not exist as a country. It has no history. And it's so important that we also remember that Ukraine has this incredible culture. In the TV show, there's this amazing chef called Kloptenko, who is the most eccentric chef you'll ever see. He won their equivalent of MasterChef. He's hilarious, incredible character. He's in Kiev right now, feeding the troops. He's turned his Michelin star type restaurant into a place for meals for both civilians and troops. But one of the things he was doing was actually taking borscht to UNESCO to get it registered as a Ukrainian dish, not as a Russian dish. And it may sound like a small thing, but he was saying this is the whole point, is that Russia has been trying to take away Ukraine's identity for so long. And they've tried to assimilate it into the Soviet Union or what it was. And so for Ukrainians, they want to remind people of the incredible history of that country, the country that Putin wants to erase. So we did this TV series. We put it out just before the conflict started. We didn't promote it because it felt a little bit wrong to be me talking about this show I did about food, but you can find it online. You know, we can share the link. And I think watching it, you will understand a lot about who Ukrainians are. There's some incredibly hard scenes to see now of families living in Advika, just talking about how fearful they are of the violence returning, how they just want to live in peace, and knowing that right now that is the epicenter of this violence. And as I say, some of those people are no longer with us already. But it also, I hope, would give people an understanding of the history of how we got to this situation. So I say you can find it online. I'm proud of what we did, but it just breaks my heart to think about it now.
Do you talk about the collectivizations of the farms under Stalin in Ukraine? In that,
yeah, absolutely. You know, there was this history of Ukrainians suffering. I mean, there's a bit where I'm sat with a Ukrainian soldier in the front lines, and we're just talking about the fact that when you take the Holodomor, which was the forced famine that was put on Ukraine just before the Second World War, then the arrival of the Nazis, the genocide of the Jewish population, then Stalin's arrival, his punishment, it just went on. And roughly in that period, 1 in 4 Ukrainians were killed. It's unbelievable to imagine the suffering that country went through the 1930s and 1940s and early 1950s. You know, most Ukrainians you meet will have lost at least one grandparent to either Stalin or to Hitler. You know, they have been this buttress between Europe and Russia and have suffered because of that. And that's exactly what's happening again, is that they are, you know, in between Europe and Russia and the geopolitics that are playing out in that country. And yeah, the generations of suffering. There is very few places in the world where you have this generational suffering. And yes, the Ukrainians are resilient. They are strong, but they are also suffering in ways that it's very hard for us to imagine.
I think a lot of people are in the West are unaware of the fact that Stalin, I mean, Putin doing what he's doing now is an echo of something that happened almost 100 years ago in Ukraine, where, you know, the Russian-centric Soviet Union came into Ukraine and starved. You called it forced starvation. There was a famine there.
Yeah.
It was caused by the Soviets just taking everyone's food away and purposefully starving 6 million Ukrainians to death.
And it was the same principle, because back then what it was is that Stalin believed that the Ukrainians were trying to be more European. He wanted to stop this. He thought they were, you know, too cultured, and it was a punishment. It was a collective punishment, and that's exactly what's happening right now. You know, Putin talks about the, you know, denazification of Ukraine, you know, which has a Jewish president. I mean, there is nonsense in what he's talking about, and he talks about the Russian, because there is a large part of Ukraine that is Russian speaking, that has Russian heritage. But there's a big difference between being a Russian speaker and wanting to be part of Russia. And, you know, I have many, many friends in the regions of Donbass, which is the mainly Russian speaking part, who, you know, have said to me, I'm going to learn to speak Ukrainian now. You know, it's for them, the idea that their name is being used as an excuse to do what's happening is horrific for them. In the TV series we made, my friend who was translating, she's actually Jewish, Russian speaking from that area. She's like, how can he use my name to justify what he is doing to this country? And, you know, it's myth after myth after myth. But, you know, you have to remember, Putin once spoke about the fall of the Soviet Union as being the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. He did not talk about the genocide. He did not talk about World War II. He thinks the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest catastrophe. And so he has always wanted to bring back this idea of, you know, the Russian, the USSR, the Soviet Union. And as part of that, Ukraine would be an oppressed nation.
Well, it's a terrifying moment. I think that you're referencing World War II there, and history hopefully will teach us some things. And one of the things that happened in World War II was people in the West sat back and thought certainly Hitler's not going to go further. Certainly he's not going to do more. Certainly it's not going to get worse. And I think that the writing has been on the wall with Putin for at least a decade now, maybe longer. But he's been slowly expanding his empire in Georgia and Ukraine, and continuing to fight these wars of extension in places like Syria. And right now, I think we all need to be paying vigilant attention to what's going on, because it could get much, much worse, and it could spread. And even if it doesn't, even if it stays contained in Ukraine, this is a humanitarian crisis, the scale of which Europe hasn't seen since World War II. And all of us, everyone in the world, should be stepping up to support. We're going to be doing we're going to be, I want to kind of tease without telling what it is that we're going to do, but in this hunt coming up this weekend, we're going to be collaborating with you to support people in Ukraine who are in most dire need right now.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this has been my life for the last 20 years, is documenting the impact of conflict around the world. And, every crisis, that they are of an equal level, whether it be documenting the wars in Sudan, Angola, in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Yemen. This is all related, all interconnected. War is the same for each person that's affected by it. And one of the things that I've witnessed and most closely documented over the years is how people living with disabilities are often the ones excluded in a humanitarian crisis. They're often the ones forgotten and not supported in the right way. And that can be from everything from in refugee camps where the toilets have steps up, so people in wheelchairs don't have access to it. It can mean that people who are blind are not able to read signs. People who are deaf do not hear the messaging of what's needed. So people with disability are always left behind, and it's important that in a crisis like this that they are given the right support. And right now in Ukraine, people with disabilities are being left behind, and they are in desperate need. And there are ways we can support, and we will come up with some of those ideas in the next days and share them. But there are direct action, things we can do immediately. We are partnering, my organization, Legacy of War Foundation, is partnering with Ukrainian organizations. And I think that's very important. These are Ukrainian organizations that have years of history. We worked last year in Afghanistan with Emergency. One of the great things about them is they have 20-something years of working. We're doing the same in Ukraine, is working with grassroots organizations that understand the people that are part of that community. In fact, one of the organizations we're working with, they are people with disabilities themselves. It is their community, and we're going to find ways to support them. And there's some things that we can do that will have a direct and positive and immediate help.
Right, you're selling, Legacy of War is selling these shirts, right?
Yeah, I mean,
I'm trying to model it, but I'm not.
There we go.
I'm not a very. I need a photographer here, Giles. This is one of the designs. There's another one that's a little bit more
racy,
colorful, a little more colorful. That I'm not currently donning.
I think actually one of the things I should say about this T-shirt, and specifically the other one that you just mentioned, they were inspired after I was working in Mosul 4 or 5 years ago during the fighting for Mosul, and I just saw the destruction of a city, and I walked away going, we just have to say no more war, and this the T-shirt we're selling is going directly to supporting all the funds raised Ukraine at the moment, but it's also a message of solidarity to people around the world affected by conflict. One of my Syrian friends is just, was wearing his T-shirt the other day, and he just is saying that we have to step back at the end of what's happening in Ukraine, but also look at all conflicts around the world. And we just have to find ways to put pressure on all of our governments to stop using violence as a means of geopolitical conversation. You cannot bomb people to get peace. This has never been the answer. It never will be the answer. Right now, we need to support Ukraine. We need to find ways for Ukraine to defend itself. But we also need to have a conversation about war and the amount of money that is spent by our governments that we support globally. So, with the T-shirt, it's raising funds for Ukraine, but it's also an act of solidarity with all people affected by conflict.
We're going to provide the link for you for where you can buy one of these shirts
Mhm.
to support Legacy of War that's working directly with organizations in Ukraine. And knowing that Giles is behind this, you can know that this is going to be the most well vetted and well connected organization and funding that you can imagine. So, and it's 100% of the profits are going to support,
Yeah.
or not profits, 100% of the after cost of t-shirt
Exactly.
proceeds.
And we're
Uh,
taking no administrative costs. We're doing nothing. And also the t-shirts are sustainable. They're environmentally friendly as well. So we made sure that that's part of it.
and they're fetching as well.
They're very fetching, especially on you.
Um, so should well, Giles, I just have to say every time I talk to you, it feels like a call to action for me. It's a constant reminder that there is more work to be done around the world, and we all have to live our lives, and we all have to tend to our families. But it is such a potent reminder that there are so many people around the world who are in dire need, and 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 we can help them in the short term, and then we can look at these bigger picture structural goals,
Yeah.
like getting our fucking governments
Mhm.
to stop spending all of our resources on the most destructive, economically and socially destructive thing possible, which is war.
Mhm.
We need to shift the way geopolitical systems work across the globe, and that should be something that we are all working on all the time, because there's nothing worse than the legacy of trauma that a war brings.
And I should just say one thing, because I know a lot of people are feeling very overwhelmed by what's happening in Ukraine and feeling completely powerless, and feeling that, in many ways, this kind of the evil of the world, the evil of men is dominating at the moment. And it's hard to see hope. And there are going to be very, very tough weeks ahead, in Ukraine and in other conflicts around the world. But I would step back again to those amazing women in Rwanda. And in the late 90s, the genocide there was one of the most horrific acts ever perpetrated on a population. Um, I remember seeing it on the news and really feeling so bleak and thinking there could never be any hope. And to be in a field with the women, the victims of that, who are now growing their tomatoes, who are laughing. We actually celebrated the harvest by buying some beers, and we sat in this field with these women laughing, full of joy and full of energy. And all I would say is to remember there is always hope. There is always a solution. There is always a way out. And at the core of that is love.
Um, well, thank you, Giles. I think it's telling that you chose to mention men and women there, because it's also, I think, incumbent on us men to acknowledge that these wars are being consistently started and perpetrated by men, and so we need to rise up and
Yeah.
fight that tide of male war.
Mhm.
Um, uh, I want to thank you and wish you well, and I know that you're burning the candle at both ends right now, like you so often are
Mhm.
in times of crisis and um, in your daily life. Giles, thank you. It's always lovely to talk to you, and I hope we can make some small impact when we collaborate this coming weekend on a project. But I think it's also just good for us to have something we can do. I think it's important for everyone to feel like I'm not single-handedly going to be solving this problem, but I am going to be contributing to a broader solution in the way that I can. And that's what we're going to be trying to do with you and Gish and Random Acts this coming weekend. Um, I also I want to just remind people that if you want to join and join in that effort, you can sign up for this coming Gish. But we'll also, and registration will also go to help providing food for refugees from Ukraine. But I also want to let everyone know that we'll be giving you ways to support whether you're participating in Gish or not. But if you want to be directly involved, in that. You can sign up for the hunt that is happening this weekend, and I think you have until Wednesday, which is what, tomorrow, to sign up for that. All right, thanks, Giles.
Thank you.
Thanks for taking the time to do this with us.
Always.
All right, bye.